Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the CEQA and Environmental Justice panel, and welcome to the in-person conference again. I mean, everybody was welcome to the big hall, but I'd like to welcome you all again, and thank you for particular interest in this subject, which I find especially exciting and fascinating because, well, I don't know, I moderate this panel, but I get to ask and invite people to join us, which I'd like to introduce you to. And by the way, is the microphone on? Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, it's not really, because the other thing is I might have a button to press. Okay, so now it's really a hot mic. Thank you. I don't have to say welcome again, but welcome again to everybody. My name is Doug Carstens. I'm an attorney with Carstens, Black and Minteer down in Southern California, but we operate all throughout the state. And it's my real pleasure to introduce to you today and share with you our guest speakers. What I'll do is introduce each person so you know who we're talking with this morning, and then each will individually come and speak. But we are welcoming questions during the presentations. We've created enough time, you can imagine from the time and length of this panel, that we're not going to be on a sort of strict clock and pressing right to the next subject. So if you do have a question when you are hearing one particular panelist presenting, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll take those to a certain point until it's time to not take them. So housekeeping-wise, there's a MCLE sign-up sheet there at the back. We're asking any attorneys who want MCLE credit to sign in there, and we'll be in touch with you about that. The application is still in process and pending, so we'll have to communicate that information to you as soon as we have that. Like I say, this to me is one of the most fascinating topics of what I find to be a very exciting assembly, CEQA and environmental justice. Environmental justice, I think we all know the definition, and now it's in the statute, thank you, in the Coastal Act. I wish it was in CEQA itself. Some people say and think we may be getting there. Some courts have recognized that it is, but there's still a lot of holdouts. A lot of people think it's not something that needs to be dealt with. But environmental justice and frontline communities are facing the problems of California that we are all facing in terms of climate change and impacts from pollution, but they're facing it, of course, in more direct and stronger ways from a place that may be harder to deal with or more difficult than many of us more fortunate in California. So by focusing on environmental justice concerns and approaches, it's a way to, I think, point out a path for all of us, but also how we can help everybody all together, like brothers and sisters. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. I think you'll see there's 4 that are listed. There's one who hasn't been able to join us quite yet, but we do have a video live from him, so I'll get to that when we get there. He may still arrive. But first, let me introduce Melissa Romero. Thank you, the Deputy Legislative Director, California Environmental Voters. And you've been here in the Capitol. I'm going to talk. I feel always odd introducing people, and it's sort of like they're right there in the room. So, you've been here in the Capitol for so many years and prioritizing and tracking legislation with Enviro Voters. So thank you for being our leadoff batter. I'm going to use the baseball example, and we'll hear from Melissa first. Juan Pruitt, right next to Melissa, is Land Use Manager at California Environmental Justice Alliance, otherwise known as CEHA. Very, very widely known and well-respected organization. Jonathan, you're the lead on CEHA's Green Zones program that utilizes the place-based strategy transforming toxic hotspots into healthy and living neighborhoods. And I'm not going to read everything in these. These bios are on the website, but to be redefining public health as an institution to prioritize environmental justice as a core component, hugely important, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. We're doing this sort of something like a coffee clatch over here with kind of everybody involved. Again, I might be finding, or unless somebody pulls a hook in me, asking too many questions and kind of interrupting your presentations as we're going. So hopefully that's going to work, and if not, just don't be cruel in the reviews or anything. The third person, which I'm still hoping may be here, is Juan Flores with the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. And why don't I introduce Juan a lot more when we either are playing his video or he's actually here in person. But Juan is a special part, as everybody is, of this panel, and I'd like to be able to talk about him when he's in the room, if he does come a little bit later. And then there's Kip Lipper. Kip, you're the Chief Policy Advisor, State Senate, and kind of amazing to me, you've served over 40, you said 47? 47 years in the legislature, during which you were Chief Policy Advisor on Energy, Environmental, and Natural Resources with 4 former California State Senate presidents pro tem. I mean, it's just amazing. One thing about Kip Lipper, there's a term in the Capitol here in Sacramento. Is it here? Well, UC Davis. Anyway, in Sacramento, to either Lipperize a bill, it means you got to run it through Kip, because all the state legislators know that you need sometimes to Lipperize something, or if you're on the wrong side of it. I also understand from reports. I don't know anything about this, but you don't.
All not true.
It's all not true.
It's all not true.
So when they say I got kipped, that's
It's all AI.
It's all AI. Okay. For the past 40 years, it's been AI. All right. So we'll hear more from Kip about the legislature and activities there in the Capitol, et cetera. Well, why don't I turn over the microphone to Melissa first. Welcome, and thank you for joining our panel today. Melissa Romero. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Oh, thank you. So since I'm going first, I want to give a little intro just to kind of prime everyone. I know you all know what CEQA is, and that's why you're here, but just a little refresher. So CEQA simply requires officials to consider environmental impacts and to do what can be done to avoid or reduce those impacts before moving forward with a project. So the main objectives of CEQA are 3 things. 1, inform decision makers and the public of potential adverse environmental impacts in projects that they carry out and approve. 2, public participation in the environmental review process. And 3, to mitigate a project's adverse environmental impacts through feasible measures or alternatives. And importantly, CEQA promotes environmental justice. And it does this because today, a lot of groups around the state rely on CEQA to uphold the rights of environmental justice communities for clean air, clean water, soil, as well as quality housing that is not negatively impacted by pollution. And often CEQA is the only tool that guarantees members of the most vulnerable communities to do so, which is to provide input on environmental and health impacts, alternatives, appropriate mitigation measures for projects that would cause harm. So CEQA also helps California reach its climate goals. CEQA ensures that local land use decisions are tracking the state's climate goals and promote transit-friendly development. CEQA also helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions by encouraging sustainable growth. And CEQA requires that major land use projects take all feasible steps to keep our air and water clean and preserve sensitive habitat and open space. CEQA also works to make development safer for Californians. So when a developer has proposed to build luxury homes, this actually happened, near Lake Tahoe without any effective wildfire evacuation plan, CEQA ensured the consideration of wildfire risk and safety. Another example, at the Richmond Chevron refinery, CEQA required the oil giant to come clean about its plan to process dirtier crude oil. And then just a study that I want to share a little bit about. A study by the BAE Urban Economics found that rigorous CEQA review did not hinder an affordable housing project that was in Richmond, and rather highlighted potential environmental problems early on in the process, which ultimately resulted in a better project that resulted in vulnerable residents being protected from air pollution, toxic soil, and water contamination that was on site.
Melissa?
So, yeah.
Can I interrupt and ask you right there if, is that BAE study, is it posted somewhere or available?
Yeah.
On the internet, a link? I mean, we can supply that later, but I just
For
want
sure, yeah.
to understand that's kind of out there and people have been citing it?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. So that's just kind of like just an overview of CEQA and some of the important things that it does. And really, what I want you all to take away is that CEQA actually makes projects better. And so the goal of CEQA is not to stop projects, which has been the narrative, and that has been created through developer interest, let's be honest. It is there to make projects better. I personally don't want to live in a new apartment building if there is water contamination and soil contamination. I don't think you do either. That is what CEQA does for us. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of CEQA, how many times it's been amended, and how some of those exemptions and streamlining laws have not materialized into the affordable housing that we need in the state. And the reason I'm focusing on this is because this is overwhelmingly the narrative, is that CEQA stops housing. So I want to talk about all of the ways that CEQA is not the same body of law that it was many decades ago. CEQA has been amended to include a lot of tools to expedite or exempt entire projects. And in 2007, what I mentioned earlier about CEQA helping us to meet our climate goals, 2007 was the year that CEQA was updated to incorporate a change that was required by the Office of Planning and Research to amend the CEQA guidelines to assist public agencies in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So that was an important year that climate change was incorporated into the guidelines. So let's talk about some of the laws over the years that updated CEQA that are in place right now. And these streamlining measures are already working, and full-blown environmental impact reports are now relatively rare. So the point that I really want you all to take away from all of this is that CEQA has actually been amended many times, and that environmental impact reports are now rare, and that additional legislative proposals to cut and chop away at CEQA are actually not necessary, and in many cases are duplicative. So SB 1925 from 2002 exempts infill housing development that meets certain criteria for design or uses such as affordable housing. SB 375 from 2008 provides streamlined CEQA review for infill mixed-use residential and transit priority projects. SB 743 from 2013 exempts transit priority projects that are consistent with a relevant specific plan and a relevant sustainable community strategy, if you're familiar with that. SB 226 from 2011 limits the review if environmental impacts were previously addressed in a planning decision. It also exempts solar installations on roofs and existing parking lots. SB 674 from 2014 broadens the existing statutory exemption for infill residential housing by allowing projects to include more neighborhood-serving commercial uses. And SB 35, passed in 2017, enables jurisdictions to approve qualified housing projects on a ministerial basis, so bypassing environmental review and other requirements. So just for the sake of not having you guys memorize this, I'm just going to list out all of the exemptions included right now. There are ministerial actions, mitigation of an emergency, existing facilities, replacements and reconstruction, small development and construction projects, affordable housing projects, urban residential projects, urban infill projects, urban residential or mixed-use housing projects in unincorporated communities, agricultural housing projects, residential employment center, mixed-use residential, transit priority areas, transit priority area and residential sustainable communities projects. So the reason why I'm listing all those out, like I said, not to have everyone memorize those, but just to give you an understanding of the breadth of exemptions and streamlining provisions that have been in law for many years now in CEQA, as we continue to face an onslaught of bills that are seeking to exempt and streamline CEQA even further, that are not needed, as you can tell.
Melissa?
Yeah?
Can I ask, because that's a really long and impressive list of exemptions, but some people say that they might be too hard to use, but are they too hard to use, or have these been used out there?
Yeah, and there is one example from SB 35 about the use of that law. And I'm forgetting the exact stats, but it was a pretty significant, I don't know if anyone here happens to know off the top of their head, but it was pretty significant in terms of the amount of housing units that were produced through the exemptions and things in that law. So happy to follow up with that information, absolutely. So additional changes to CEQA beyond all of those that I just listed might actually do less to promote development and do more to undermine this law that helps ensure development is done responsibly. And it's important to recognize that whenever the legislature eliminates environmental review requirements through streamlining provisions, that there may actually not be any mitigation for impacts that are causing public health or other harms. So, concerning. So I want to talk a little bit more about sort of the anti-CEQA narrative that I'm sure many of you have heard, just as I have, and how this kind of became successful and what the real barriers are to affordable housing. Because let's be clear, we have an affordable housing crisis. So prior to CEQA's enactment, public agencies and local governments could approve a project of any size without considering their impact on the environment, including negative impacts to public health. And CEQA is, of course, often unfairly accused of stopping housing projects and other projects, but that's actually not the way the law works. CEQA is simply requiring officials to consider environmental impacts and to do what they can to avoid or reduce those impacts before moving forward. And so who benefits when environmental review is bypassed? Developers are the ones who overwhelmingly benefit. And so when they can find a way to get away without doing environmental review, that is more money in their pockets. They are overwhelmingly the ones who benefit. You and I, who are going to move into that apartment complex that now has soil contamination that hasn't been addressed, are not the ones who are going to benefit. And I'll talk a little bit later about the cost of CEQA review for those types of projects to really prove the point that it is not driving up costs for you and I. Many housing projects are also already exempt from environmental review. So although, or altogether, it's either through infill exemption or by tiering from environmental review already conducted on specific community plans. So important things to consider for housing specifically. CEQA requires that the reviewing agency evaluate whether the project would displace existing populations, physically divide communities, or promote urban sprawl. So those types of inquiries both protect existing communities and also encourage infill housing alternatives. So I want to talk now about some of the causes of the affordable housing crisis. It is a crisis that stems from a number of really complex factors, and those things include local zoning practices, fluctuating interest rates, widening income gaps, the high cost of land and materials, and many reasons why we have really exceptionally high housing prices in the state is because of some of those things. High construction costs from land, materials, labor. 2, layers of local zoning restrictions. 3, high development impact fees that are shifting the cost of infrastructure from the public to private sectors and ultimately to buyers and renters. And 4, speculative land ownership. That is a whole rabbit hole. That is a crazy one. So I want to talk about the rate of litigation now for projects that are alleging noncompliance with CEQA, which is very low. So from 2002 to 2015, fewer than 1 out of every 100 projects reviewed under CEQA resulted in a lawsuit. 1 out of every 100 projects, including exempt projects. And from 2013 to 2015, that rate was even lower at 0.7%. From 2002 to 2015, California averaged about 195 CEQA lawsuits per year with no increasing pattern over time. No increasing pattern over time. A 2018 survey of cities and counties that was done by the Association of Environmental Professionals found that from 2015 to 2017, only 5.6% of housing projects that contained 5 or more units were subject to a full environmental impact review. Oh my God, can't talk. While 51.6% used some form of CEQA exemption or streamlined review. So 5.6% of housing projects that had 5 units or more had to do an EIR. 51.6% were used some sort of exemption or streamlining. So that study shows that a lot of the housing projects that use some form of CEQA streamlining also alluded to the fact that streamlining has actually not necessarily led to sufficient housing production. So as you can tell, there are many, many different streamlining and exemptions for CEQA in statute now, and we still have an affordable housing crisis. And so all of the attention, unfortunately, goes to further streamlining, further exempting housing from CEQA, when the time and the history has actually shown us that that hasn't actually solved the problem. There are other things that we have to focus on. And if we don't focus on those things, guess what? We're gonna be in an affordable housing crisis for a lot longer. So I wanna just end with sharing a few really compelling statistics and things from some reports that I thought this audience would really appreciate. So 2016 report published by the Rose Foundation, which analyzed the cost of CEQA compliance by looking at case studies of 5 projects located all throughout California, found that direct environmental review costs for those 5 projects ranged from 0.025 to 0.6% of the total project costs. And then the updated report in 2021, which had 3 new case studies, saw that direct environmental review costs ranged from 0.15% to 0.5% of the total project cost. So that is a very small percent of a total project cost. So when you hear the argument of CEQA is causing housing projects to cost so much more, maybe point them to that report. In 2018, the Association of Environmental Professionals survey that looked at 46 cities and counties it basically said that high development costs, lack of financing, and site availability were reported by those 46 cities and counties as the top biggest barriers to developing affordable housing in California. So I'm almost done, don't worry. In 2017, UC Berkeley study that looked at 5 Bay Area cities found that many cities already streamlined CEQA review for housing projects, and that most projects do not involve full environmental impact reports. And in fact, that study actually looked at or observed that local planning provisions have a much greater impact on the pace of housing development. Another report in 2018 by the Association of Environmental Professionals, which was a survey that had a really wide range of geographic response from cities and counties that made up about 54% of the state's multifamily permit activity. So that's quite a big chunk. In one of those studies that comprehensively surveyed how CEQA's impact on housing production. And so that survey found that between 2015 and 2017, streamlining and exemptions were the predominant type of environmental review that was used for housing projects. And 42% of the respondents said that streamlining and exemptions were the types of environmental review that they were using for housing projects. So 42% of projects. 36% of projects were using mitigated negative declarations, and EIRs, environmental impact reviews, were only used for 6% of all of the housing projects in all of those different cities and counties. And those were generally reserved for much larger projects that had a greater potential for environmental impacts. So, the evidence demonstrates that CEQA has not blocked housing production. So why are we still focused all the time on streamlining, exempting CEQA in order to solve the housing crisis? Well, I think that's a discussion point, but over the years, the legislature has introduced bill after bill after bill. To this day, we continue to see this. Death by 1,000 cuts to CEQA, very duplicative, proposals, unfortunately, things that are not going to actually solve the root causes of the housing crisis, yet that is where the attention is, and that's where it stays, that's something that should concern all of us, frankly. Even the governor last year introduced a package of budget trailer bills, which essentially is you can do policy change through the budget. It's a very opaque and not very participatory or collaborative way to do it. It's a little shady, to be honest. It's sort of a way to slip things in and just kind of, push them through the really, really quick process without much input. That's tied to the budget, so the legislators, of course, have to vote on it. So that last year we saw the governor at the last minute introduce budget trailer bills that would streamline CEQA in many ways for infrastructure projects. And so we're seeing this narrative being used for important infrastructure that we need as a society. So we need clean energy, we need housing, we need all of those things. And unfortunately, CEQA is the one thing that is always being pointed to as we have to streamline, we have to exempt in order to speed this up. And so rather than looking at the root causes of the problem, rather than looking at how do we make this process more efficient, how do we make this process work, rather than saying let's just throw it out, that is unfortunately what the narrative is right now in the legislature. So that is why it was important for me to just share all of that with you so that we can have this discussion afterwards with all of that in mind. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Melissa. I mean, yeah, just before sitting and turning over to Jonathan, wanted to ask if there was any questions. I had a couple, or at least one, but just to see, as we have you up right now, I see several, but can I take yours first, please? And maybe I'll bring the microphone, or I don't know if people want to yell out, but here.
You were talking about the different reasons that the housing crisis exists. A lot of those I was familiar with, but one really caught my attention. You said speculative land ownership.
Yeah.
The way you introduced it really caught my attention. You said it was a whole rabbit hole. Can you just give a couple sentence explanation of what that means?
Yeah, so speculative land ownership is sort of like corporations or foreign interests buying up large plots of land. Recently, I was reading a story about how Zillow was buying up like entire neighborhoods and driving up the cost of the houses in that neighborhood. It's corporate greed at its worst, is what it is. And it's happening a lot more than I think we all really understand and know. And some stories come out about that kind of stuff, but it is a big problem. It is a huge problem that we have, is just corporate ownership of large plots of land and buying up houses and selling them for way more than they were before. And it's leading to higher prices for sure. There's not enough checks and balances on that kind of activity.
And thank you. One of my questions was about the timing of the market when, certain permits will be granted already, but they won't be built against. I think 40 or some number in 40,000 in San Francisco are permitted but not built yet because people are timing the market to the highest profit.
Yeah.
So a lot of, I think there was another question right here and yours.
Yeah, two comments. One is about the question about what is all this legislation doing to housing production. And I spent some time looking at HCD's, Housing Community Development Department's statistics for housing production over the last maybe 10, 15 years. And the overwhelming majority of the production is market rate.
Yeah.
There is no, and there doesn't seem to be any difference over time in terms of what percentage of housing is low and moderate income, the type of housing we're looking for in terms of the affordable housing crisis. All of these bills are being passed. There's no change.
Yeah.
We're still dealing primarily, almost entirely, market rate housing. So to say we need to make it easier to build housing, I think, is a misstatement. What we need is to make it easier to build affordable housing. And all of these CEQA exemptions and CEQA narrowings, a lot of them don't say anything about affordability.
And if they do, it's like a pitiful small little percentage, I'll be honest. It's like ridiculous what we have to say. Oh, affordable housing advocates say, oh, well, can you make it bigger? And for some reason, the answer is no.
And the other thing I want to point out is you've talked about all of the different CEQA exemptions for housing and how they've been streamlining CEQA. I think sometimes streamlining is really not the right term. They've been chopping it down.
Yeah.
And one of the ones that I am personally familiar with SB 35 and how that has been manipulated in terms of the SB 35 says, well, these housing projects, we're going to make sure that they don't have any environmental impacts. We're going to eliminate, say that you're not eligible for SB 35 if your project is on a wetland, if your project is an endangered species habitat, da-da-da-da-da-da. One of the exemptions is saying, well, if your project involves might affect historic structures, then you can't use SB 35. Well, there was a project in Berkeley where they put in an SB 35 project, and it was right on top of a Native American shell mound, a very important Native American cultural resource. And the court said, well, a shell mound that's buried under the ground, that's not a structure, so it's not covered. So they can go ahead with their SB 35 with no environmental review. I think these are problems.
Yeah.
And because thank you, Stuart, even though it wasn't quite a question, I don't know if you wanted to comment more, but there was another question right behind.
This is real quick. Okay. I just wanted a list of every study that you cited.
Okay.
I think that would be an excellent resource.
Yeah, for sure. I'll figure out how to follow up with that. I don't know how we're going to do it, but.
Yeah, I was thinking that the same thing because there are places. Here's Rachel with a hand up. You want to say something?
I just wanted to talk about where you can find this.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Rachel.
So you can find them on the website of an organization called CEQA Works. So it's CEQAworks.org, and there's a tab for reports, and it has each one.
All of those are going to be there, yeah. And probably even more. Yeah.
Isn't this great? I mean, in a room like this, it's sort of like you ask the question and somebody knows the
Yeah, somebody knows if I don't.
Dan O'Connell.
I just wanted to reinforce your comments about speculative land ownership. I was the first farmland conservation director in the southern San Joaquin Valley. I did the first easements from mitigation in Kern County with farmers in the history and in Tulare County. Both mitigation projects that paired with public dollars. So first of all, CEQA was really important in instigating farmland conservation, even in a practical way. I would go to farmers and say, there's this great way to save your farmland where you don't have to develop. And some of them were large growers. And I had a big Fresno grower come to me, and I think it was baiting me and trying to get me to squeal as an environmentalist, get me out of, unmask me maybe. The farmer, the grower, the industrial owner of land said, why should I do that? I'm purposely buying land in the line of development in order to develop the farmland. So, and then I worked for American Farmland Trust later. AFT did research to look at the profit margins that were happening on sprawl development on the sphere of influence of cities. Numbers as high as 30% profit margins were coming out. I begged them to release the information. That still has never been out. But we need to do research on what the profit margins are on the edge as compared to the infill. And then finally, some of the solutions to this might not be CEQA related, just community benefit agreements on every annexation, ensuring equity, agroecological production, really cool, hybrid, stabilize the sphere of our cities. It's the moment that we need to do this. Infill is equity development, right? And the sprawl is development for folks that are very high income, and I could go into the racism of the sprawl as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Dan O'Connell, everybody. I happen to know you, so just wanted to give you a plug. I'm going to come around there to get And I don't know if Melissa, you wanted any comment or?
No, yeah, I'm loving the comments.
Because we do have a housing panel on the CEQA track right after this one, and we would like to hear from Jonathan and Kip in just a moment, if you guys don't mind, just, maybe a last question. But we'll have more time later.
Hi, I don't want to send us too far off track here, but I'm genuinely interested in your opinion on, I grew up in Oakland, born and raised there, and there's a sort of narrative from my community that there's a lot of manipulation of CEQA and other environmental laws for the sort of NIMBY quote movement.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you can speak to that and how you
Absolutely, yeah. I think it would be actually horrible if environmentalists didn't recognize the fact that people are using this law for the wrong reasons. And here's what is difficult. There are people using this law for the wrong reasons, meaning like they don't want their view obscured, they don't want an apartment next to their house because they're racist and classist, like there's all these reasons that people use this tool for bad things. But guess what? They're gonna use other tools too. It's not gonna stop there. And unfortunately, those stories get really, they get used. Those kinds of stories get used to chip away at CEQA in ways that don't just impact the bad actors, they also impact the good actors. This is something I tell legislators and their staff all the time. I go, I understand the story and the concern that you're trying to address in your community. That's really, whatever the story was, that's horrible. I understand why you want to address that. But here's the thing. Your bill, your law, would actually affect the good actors too. There's not a way for us to legislate saying this only applies to bad actors. And so when you continue to exempt more and more projects and streamline more and more projects, you're applying the consequence for the bad actors to everyone across the board. And so, it is a problem, but it's also not unique to just CEQA. I mean, rich people are gonna, use whatever tools at their disposal to try and fight back against something they don't want, because they have the time, they have the money. And that's, a societal problem that we have to figure out how to solve, but getting rid of CEQA is not gonna solve it. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Melissa, and everybody. I'd like to thank Melissa. We'll come and keep on talking, but just great to hear what you're saying here. So thank you. Well, let me ask Jonathan if you wouldn't come on up and please let's move to this next.
Hey everyone, morning. Thank you for being here on a Saturday. I am the land use program manager at CEHA, the California Environmental Justice Alliance. And just to give you some background on what CEHA is, CEHA is a statewide community-led alliance that we really are meant to work with our local organizers that are working on the ground and for us to advocate to combat those issues that are happening on the ground at the state level. And to give you context on sort of our membership, we have over 35,000 Asian American, Pacific Islander, Latinx, African American residents from the San Francisco Bay Area, San Joaquin Valley, Los Angeles Central Coast, Inland Empire, Eastern Coachella Valley, and San Diego, Tijuana areas. And for the discussion for CEQA, many of our CEHA organizations rely on it. They rely on it because it allows the disclosure and finds ways to mitigate those environmental impacts that they themselves historically are dealing with on the ground. One of the areas that some of the things that they look at is, to advocate for the clean air, water, and the soil free from pollution and toxic contamination. And it's having that robust CEQA process that is vital for our EJ communities to rely on the law so that they can participate in the local planning that's happening in the area, and they can also safeguard those communities. We know that studies demonstrate that and the reason why they're environmental justice communities is because they disproportionately deal with more environmental pollution than other communities. And that because of inconsistent land use and everything else. And in Cali, PA, from the Cali, PA, they found that top 10% most environmental burden communities are 90% people of color. These frontline communities, they frequently lack the necessary resources to fight against those things, fight for those environmental harms, and they don't have a say in those critical land use decisions. And so with that further historical disenfranchisement that comes from the EJ communities, it's laws that CEQA that really hold accountable and provides transparency and is sort of that avenue to address and redress the legacies of environmental degradation and the harm. I wanted to provide sort of examples as to how our CEHA members have utilized CEQA to really fight and protect the communities. One case study, if folks are sort of familiar with the Inland Empire, it's in Riverside counties. There's a huge, you've probably seen the news most recently or in the articles about all of these warehouses that are being built. If you've ever been there, it's warehouses first, then housing. There are probably more trucks than there are actual cars in those things. That's just how bad it is. The World Logistics Center over in Moreno Valley, in the city of Moreno Valley, which is in Riverside County, this was in 2015. One of our organizations, the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice, or CCAJ, they've been really big proponents on fighting against the warehousing. The city of Moreno Valley, they approved this project called the World Logistics Center. And this World Logistics Center, just to give you a feel, a typical warehouse, is around, I would say the most, like in Stockton, we had one that was like about 3.6 million square feet. This one was 40.6 million square feet of development. That's 3,800 acres. Now the proposal in the EIR, it went through CEQA and went to the EIR. And in the EIR, in the Environmental Impact Report, it stated that it would bring in 14,000 truck trips per day. Trucks would transport goods from LA to Long Beach to Moreno Valley, and often on the 2-lane roads. The diesel trucks we know today would produce an enormous amount of pollution and severely impacting the air quality, especially those communities that live there. And one of the issues that we see is there's always an inconsistency of land uses where, yes, it may not, like the communities that live across from these warehouses don't live in the city, they live in the county. And there's an inconsistent, ensuring those people are also considered, because it doesn't matter what line you're on. You're still having to deal with the environmental impacts, the cumulative impacts that come from it. And over the time that the project went through, public agencies, the public provided comments that there was a huge issue with this. And agencies, actually, funny enough, provided comments, and they warned that the EIR for the project did not adequately analyze or mitigate many impacts, and those impacts being public health. So, to give you a long story short, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, Riverside County, and CCAJ and allied community organizations, they actually won a lawsuit, a CEQA lawsuit, and they were able to secure nearly $50 million in additional mitigation and other commitments to protect the vulnerable community. And I wanted to provide sort of just like a list of what those projects are, like what are those mitigations that come from it. They were able to bring in advanced electrification logistics equipment from trucks to forklifts. They were able to deliver thousands of 100,000 EV grants in Moreno Valley for residents for electric cars. They would increase Moreno Valley's solar power by installing additional rooftop solar on these warehouse facilities that would actually meet 50% of the warehouse demand. And then they would provide $5 million in air filtration and noise mitigation impacts that come from it. And there's also another list of things which we can definitely share, but that just gives you sort of a snippet as to like CEQA will hold projects accountable and provide and ensure those mitigation are incorporated. Another project I wanted to give you was in South Fresno, the Amazon warehouse projects. We know there's a lot of warehouses and a lot of them are being Amazon. The developer, G4 Enterprises, they applied for approval of a large 469,000 square foot project. And this was actually going to be an expansion project from what there was already an Amazon warehouse that was there. In the EIR, the project said it would operate 24/7. It would bring 3,000 vehicle trips per day. Where I was mentioning about the land use inconsistencies across from city to county, in this one it was the same way, where it was sited across homes in unincorporated Fresno County, and it was actually near a school. And they would be sharing that same truck, they would be sharing that same line, that road, as those trucks will be doing. That local low-income and communities of color, they're proportionally dealing with living next to industrial warehouse sites and the health impacts that come from this. And through going through the EIR, South Fresno Community Alliance and the Leadership Council, one of CEQA's partners, they appealed the city's approval to the Planning Commission and stated that there was not enough environmental review that came from it. And so the lack of air quality and the public health, the traffic, the noise, and the night light analysis was flawed, and there needed to be more work that went into it. And they needed to really consult with the community and to create those sort of protections. And it went through a settlement, and in that settlement it was going to reduce the environmental impacts, create community benefits fund to mitigate the current and future truck impacts that came from it. And that's one I could definitely give you, which happened 2019. And in all of these examples, I think one of the successes as to how this comes to be is being honest about, you cannot take away what happens when environmental degradation does to your public health. People that are on the ground live there, they can provide their stories, our members can provide those stories and share with you, this is what's happening on the ground, and this is what the evidence shows. And CEQA is supposed to ensure that those projects are held accountable so that doesn't happen anymore for those historical pollution sources that come to those communities. The last thing I really want to share is, when it comes to CEQA and other things, it leads to really good alliances, and in those alliances is to really look at the connection between housing and environmental justice. And so for us, when we're working with housing justice groups, we're finding ways to really further the coordination and conversations with others about how CEQA protects projects like housing to ensure that they are built correctly. I want to give you sort of a project as an example as to, without CEQA, it would have impacted people living there. This project called the Avenue 34 project. It was proposed back in 2021. It was proposed in Lincoln Heights, Los Angeles, and it was built to be on a site of Welch's former industrial dry cleaner site. And on that dry cleaner site, the project itself went through a remediation back in, I don't know when it was. And through that remediation, the project was fully remediated. And because that project was fully remediated, the project was trying to go through a mitigated negative declaration. That means the project does not have to do a full EIR process. It doesn't have to test the soil or anything like that, just because it had the historical context that it went through that whole, the soil was remediated, so there's no need to do any more testing. The problem is, funny enough, residents, they had concerns because they said, no, we know that there is still soil, and DTSC, the Department of Toxic Substance Control, unfortunately did not do a good job. They did a remediation plan for the project that was there, but unfortunately in that remediation plan, it did not look at all of the other surrounding sites that was around that proposed project. And through an analysis, they were able to find that there was, through an old LA Times article back in 1980, there was 250 illegally stored barrels of toxic chemicals that leaked into the ground from the adjacent site. And they later tested in late 2021 that actually that site, still lingering, back in the day still has chemicals. And the chemicals, the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds, were more than 4,000 times. They were higher, 4 times higher than what is recommended for safe residential standards. And one of the chemicals that was found was PCE. I have no idea how to say it. I'm not a chemist. I'm not going to say it at all. But let's just say it does a huge impact to your nervous system. But just remember, there is a proposed project, the Avenue 34 project, 468 housing units, including 66 very low-income units, which is important. We understand it is important. We want housing to be built. But the problem is, say if the project did go through without having to deal with CEQA and not having to have that public input that came from the people, and those people, you know, they kept on providing sort of like details about a historical context, that there is an article about the chemical leaking from the barrels. Unfortunately, that wouldn't have been really heard. It would have been through deaf ears. And that's where I tell you, that's where it's important having that public input through the CEQA process ensures projects like this are fully remediated even from the surrounding communities. So I just wanted to share with that, and I thank you and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. I mean, I had a question, but I see a couple in the audience first. Let me get the person in the back first.
Thank you very much. I just want to, there is a question here, but I'm going to preface, you know, in your first example where you talk about there's mitigation by putting, you know, solar on the rooftops and so forth and so on. There's still the fact that the people are going to be breathing diesel emissions. And so the comment, my comment and agenda would be that really a lot of the laws in CEQA don't go far enough, and that you have to actually mitigate the actual, not just sort of greenwash it, but actually mitigate the actual issue of people, they're going to develop asthma as children and, you know, have poor health throughout their lives because they're inhaling diesel emissions. Where in the conversation is there anything about the emissions themselves of vehicles and transitioning, you know, fleet vehicles and so forth to other sources besides the burning of fossil fuels? And I would say that I was a public policy maker and had to do this at a dais. You know, I did a bus project, federally funded bus project, and we were able to use alternative fuel sources for those large vehicles. So the technology exists, but where is that connect, as opposed to sort of saying, well, we did all these other things, but we're not really doing the thing that's actually impacting the disproportionately impacted communities of color?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, I mean, I can give you, I don't know that the details behind the scenes, but I can sort of give you details. I also deal with, personally, I used to live in Stockton, and we deal with warehousing right now. I mean, we were able to pass a warehouse ordinance that ensured, like, it was a really robust ordinance, taking elements from what was in City of Fontana and others of measures that ensured warehouse development to be very good for, like, better for environmentalist communities. But unfortunately, yes, you're absolutely right. There's still that lingering process of the transition from the diesel to the EVs or the electric trucks is still not fast enough. When we were trying to advocate for a strict timeline, like, because this process went through a CEQA lawsuit for the project, the example I'm talking about for in Stockton, one of the issues was from the developers as well as others. They were saying how it was unfortunately not financially feasible for them to incorporate such measures as of yet until CARB is able to enforce. So, like, right now there's an advanced clean fleet rule that is statewide considered, but it still has to go through US EPA. And the US EPA has to approve it, and over that time is where they're trying to work onto that sort of timeline. What we're hoping is, in addition to electric fleets, is also to consider the impacts that it's going to do onto the grid. And so having like a localized energy source, like ensuring solar, is at least a stepping stone to get some sort of electricity into that facility, and power to get to that facility, which will 50% do it for the warehouse, and hopefully for the rest will do it for the electric trucks over time, and then go back into the grid. That's the only details I could really share with you, because of the fact that with CEQA, there's also the other impacts of like getting the infrastructure, how the infrastructure is to be able to do electric vehicles, electric trucks, charging station, that sort of thing.
That should be the standard.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There should be a standard for it.
And Jonathan, maybe back here first.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for the work in the Inland Empire. It's been kind of a mess and slowly making progress. But I just want to remind folks that a lot of this is really up to us on the demand side, because the warehousing in the Inland Empire also is connected to all the distribution warehouses, particularly for outfits like Amazon. As a small tool manufacturer as well as an environmentalist, please don't buy from Amazon, period. It affects so much of our lives, so much local employment, so much manufacturing and distribution, and the more and more we go to centralized economy and outfits like Amazon, the worse this is. They've got the money, they've got the lawyers, so buying starts with us. Thank you.
Okay, and then there was one here and there, and maybe others.
Yeah, I'm going back to your, was it 34th Avenue project?
Avenue 34, yes.
Avenue 34, yeah. And the fact that there were toxics around the site that they were going to build on. And there's a real big problem with CEQA in terms of those sort of sites, and you may be aware of it, and other people may be aware of it. It's what's called reverse CEQA. And the Supreme Court, California Supreme Court, about 8 years ago, decided the case, and that said reverse CEQA is not a possibility. You can't look at the effects of the environment on a project. And so if you have toxics in sites surrounding the site you're going to build on, and it turns out that those toxics are going to affect the site you're going to build on, are going to affect the people in that site, the Supreme Court said you can't touch that with CEQA. You can't address that in CEQA. And it's a problem. They did allow an exception where if the project makes the situation worse, then you do have to look at the impacts. But if the project is just building on a site and that site is being affected by the surrounding environment, then CEQA, what the Supreme Court said is CEQA doesn't apply. This is really a big problem in the Bay Area because we have lots of shoreline areas where we have, basically these are areas that used to be not very desirable. So there are lots of low-income people, there are lots of communities of color in these shoreline areas. Those shoreline areas are also where a lot of industrial development happened. And that industrial development has left huge amounts of toxics under the ground. And we now have sea level rise, bringing those toxics up to the surface. And it's going to affect those communities, but right now, the way CEQA is right now, you can't touch it. You can't deal with it. And it's unfortunate. And I'm hoping maybe something can be done to modify CEQA so that at least when you're dealing with disadvantaged communities, you can take a look at that.
And I don't know if you wanted to.
Well, I mean, it just reminded me sort of what we see as well with CEQA, with streamlining CEQA, a lot of the language, a lot of the bill language, you know, when considering, okay, it goes through CEQA streamlining, but as a way to compromise for EJ communities is to ensure that if the project, the housing project, making sure it's not on a Cortesi's list, on the Cortesi's list. For those who don't know, the Cortesi's list is supposed to be a huge, robust plethora of list for toxic sites across California. But when you talk to folks like Department of Toxic Substance Control, they themselves said there's over 50,000 that are still not listed on there. They know for sure they probably missed. And so I didn't include that, I forgot to incorporate it in when I was talking for the Avenue 34 project. The reason why that project was also able to get NMD, mitigative negative declaration, is because it was on the Cortesi's list, but the adjacent sites were not. Where the barrels were dumped were not.
I think that it's a related point, and that is that these CEQA exemptions rely on other laws to protect the residents and protect the disadvantaged communities. And things like ETSC are just really, really malfunctioning. You can't rely on it. Mm-hmm. And yet, that's what you're stuck with.
Yeah. So the thing is we should not just rely on Cortese's list as being a proxy to all these projects, because you have these exemptions, these sort of examples like the Avenue 34 that's goes against what we're saying here about using Cortese's as a proxy.
All right, and if I don't know your name when I hand you the mic, I'm sorry, but Jennifer Gannett, I definitely know, so here's.
Well, I actually had a follow-up question. So I guess in the instance that Jonathan raised right now, but what about the environmental review for things we are doing dig and haul, and that dig and haul will affect the impact the community that's surrounding it?
I'm sorry.
Like if you're doing a dig and haul, so you are building on top of the soil, but that soil needs grading for whatever X, Y, and Z reasons, but that technically wouldn't that theoretically have to go through some type of
Well, DTSC a lot of times does their
Right.
projects under NAGDAX.
Right.
So there isn't really environmental review.
Okay. Yeah, it's well, let me get to this other question. A lot of observations, and we do have a question and answer at the end after Kip in a couple minutes, but let me get this one.
Hi, I'll make this quick.
I'm sorry, I didn't turn it on. It's on. Oh, it is on. Please, yeah.
Oh, okay. My name's Chris. I actually grew up near the Pomona area, so I'm really glad you mentioned the Inland Empire, because it's a environmentally neglected area. And one thing that you touched on was faulty EIR reports and also information sharing to the community. Both of those, I think, specifically information sharing is a crucial part of CEQA to actually mobilize people to understand why they're having negative health effects or be able to have the record. And so I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about CEHA's role in connecting the EJ communities to the EIR reports that are conducted and like translating that for them, and also identifying for the community where the reports are faulty, and just a little bit about CEHA's work.
I'll try my best to answer some like those three-part questions. So for CEHA themselves, we have the reliance is on our members on the ground. So folks like Leadership Council, Justice for Accountability, over that is covering Merced as well as in Fresno. You have the Communities for Better Environment that has hubs in the Bay Area and LA. You have folks like Scope in LA. You have folks like CAUSE, or CCAJ for the World Logistics Center, as well as others. They are the ones that directly go to the residents. They have the connections with the residents. They work with them on the ground. And unfortunately, yeah, you're right. You hit on something where it's like all these things, CEQA doesn't enforce it, but the projects, the project descriptions are not translated, and they're not interpreted in a way where residents can understand them. And so just imagine, I can give you an example. The Stockton warehouse project that I was mentioning, that was 3.6 million square feet. The residents across the street are county. They all speak Spanish, but they don't have any information they didn't know anything about the project, because like some of them got notices, but only it cut in half, where they only did about like those that were within 1,000 feet from the project, but there's still other people outside the 1,000 feet that got the notification. But even then, the notification was not in Spanish. So those people wouldn't know exactly what it is. The other thing that's a huge issue is you're talking about renters and renters who live there. Imagine if you're a renter living next to a proposed project. You're a long-time renter. You've been living there for a while. You have a trusted relationship with the landlord, and there's no reason for them to evict you or anything. And yet there's a proposed project next to where you're lived next to a warehouse. That's going to impact you as well. You're a renter. Doesn't mean even though you're not on the home, you're still a renter. Your health is still important. Unfortunately, the notice doesn't go to you. The notice goes to the landlord. And so imagine the landlord lived in another state and was able to get this information. Unfortunately, it would really depend on if the landlord would give you that information or not, so that you are aware as well of these proposed projects. And so I think there's also that issue there. There needs to be some sort of closing of that loop, or that needs to be that sort of feedback loop that also goes to the renters, because they themselves don't get that notice of information. Yeah, I think I pretty much covered it.
And I mean, thank you, Jonathan. I'd like to move on. I know there's other questions, but I hope to be able to get to them, because I really want to hear from Kip Lipper. But just before doing that, I would like to play a 1-minute video. I'm looking at the door like he might be entering High Sage. A 1-minute video from Juan Flores, who again was one of our panelists, couldn't be here today, but he has made a video that's posted online, along with some others that are made by CEQA Works. There's a filmmaker, again, named Kevin Johnson, who was mentioned today. That's not those other two Kevin Johnsons, but he's running around. He's a board member here. We'll see him probably at lunch. So CEQA Works coordinated with him to make these films. This one's an excerpt of an 8-minute film. I'm not going to play 8 minutes, this morning. It's, 1 minute is what this film is. I'd like to listen to it, absorb it, and then turn to Kip on the legislative front. But let me make sure if the technology works and I can just hit a button. Let's listen to Juan.
Laws and democracy in America are being fought by industries, just like the oil industry, who are trying to bring down protective laws like CEQA that have empowered our communities, that have given them the tools to raise up, to go up to the court, to go up to their city council and say, wait a minute, not that easy. Your job is to protect us. Not to protect the benefits of an industry, but to protect the people that live within the city boundaries. And here's CEQA, and CEQA is giving us this power. You take that away from the communities, especially low-income communities, communities of color of California, and you take their power. You take their American dream. And not only the American dream of these communities, but the American dream of the nation as a whole.
I should have left it on full screen, but yes, please do clap if you take their dreams. It's just a very powerful message, and again, I really appreciated Juan working with the CEQA Works Coalition and all of us to present that. I think it makes a good encapsulation of a lot of what we've heard this morning. So let me, again, we've introduced you much earlier. I think we still remember you and will for a long time, but Kim, if you'd like to come up, I think your slide is right here.
And I use this, right?
Kip Lipper. Okay. And yes, does that advance? I'm not sure if it's on the
there we go.
slideshow.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, and I can actually see it. That makes it good. Well, good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here. My name is Kip Lipper, and I'm a CEQAholic. It's a little hard to follow the two prior speakers who did such a wonderful job of talking about this singularly important law, but I'm going to try to do that, and I'm going to try to keep it quick and light because I know our time is short. The first thing I do want to say is I always start my presentations with a legislative disclaimer that the opinions expressed by the presenter, that would be me, are his alone and do not necessarily represent the views of the California Senate or any member of the Senate, particularly my boss, the Senate pro tempore. That's a long way of saying if I offend anybody, which I inevitably will, or say anything, please don't tweet it out and say Kip Lipper, who works for the Senate, said such and such. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the CEQA statutory law, and this may be a little bit down memory lane for some of you, particularly the younger people. Review some budgetary policy and political dynamics affecting CEQA, especially in the environmental justice context, and preview some of the issues that are coming up in 2024. Before I get to that, though, I do want to say a couple things. One, Doug, I do want you to know there is a definition of environmental justice in the government code. So there is a statutory definition. Hilda Solis, who was then in the Assembly, authored it in 1998, I think, and so there is a good definition there if anybody wants to look it up. I think the prior presenters kind of did a good job of, and particularly Melissa, talking about how CEQA is treated in the legislative context. And again, after all, this is a statute. It's not a constitutional amendment. It's not strictly a court decision, although obviously court decisions are vital and important to CEQA, both in some cases positively and some negatively. But the biggest thing that I think Melissa touched on a lot was, and Jonathan too, is how little understood the law is. And it's a complicated body of law. It's been around a long time. The legislature is made up of a lot of new faces who come in, many of whom are deeply committed to good environmental policy. But as Melissa noted, all they hear about CEQA is what a pain in the ass it is and how it blocks projects, including important projects, including environmentally beneficial projects, including, shockingly, stadiums and sports arenas and a few other things. So I think, there is a dearth of understanding and knowledge of the importance of CEQA in today's California legislature. And I think the work that CEQA Works and PCL and others do and environmental voters is critical in terms of educating them. I actually, it's funny, I think of CEQA as actually the granddaddy of environmental justice laws, because unlike statutory laws that affect agencies like the Air Resources Board or DTSC, which was mentioned a moment ago, CEQA empowers communities, not state agencies. It empowers communities to take action. And I think that's a very different thing from most of modern environmental law. As I mentioned, CEQA is often under attack, despite, Melissa did a wonderful job of citing statistics that are factual and correct, and I think they're pretty much the same that have been there since 20 and 30 years ago. But nonetheless, someone will find that one project that got held up because of a legitimate CEQA issue and blame the entire dearth of affordable housing on CEQA, and that's pretty standard. I might say not just with Republican pro-business legislators, but also with Democrats. As someone mentioned earlier about the reverse CEQA issue, very few bills go through the legislature that strengthen CEQA. We're almost always working to protect what we have and to prevent much more frontal attacks. And sometimes that's successful and sometimes it's unsuccessful. And in the more recent years, the debates tend to be polarized and uninformed, as you can imagine. The easiest solution to every problem is to exempt things from CEQA. And again, there are very few, partly because there are fewer lawyers in the legislature than there were 30 and 40 years ago. There just aren't a lot of people who understand the ins and outs of CEQA and the importance and uniqueness of the statute. Environmental groups do a pretty good job of defending CEQA, and many, like PCL and others, try to find a way to go toe-to-toe with authors and make improvements to bills to make them less bad, and that's a good thing. That's kind of how the legislative process works. Business developer groups oppose CEQA, even though their lobby, in my view, is distressingly lousy. They're not, again, they speak in slogans and mostly in kind of, little snippets as opposed to getting into the substance of the law. Administrations, including this one, certainly the Brown administration. I once had Jerry Brown come up to me in a restaurant and yell at me saying, "You need to fix CEQA." I said, "Governor, you have the Office of Planning and Research. You've got some ability on your own." But administrations just don't understand it, and I think they're agencies. I mean, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but some in the environmental community, canonize the State Air Resources Board as this great agency that's doing wonderful things on climate. But the fact is, they don't use CEQA or understand CEQA nearly as much as they should, and that's why we have major problems with things like the low carbon fuel standard and the cap and trade program. Caltrans is another example of an agency that you guys know about this. I'm trying to remember, someone recently got fired at Caltrans, a young woman, for having the temerity to suggest that building more freeways is not the way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Business groups fight with themselves on CEQA. It's kind of funny, and it's used as an anti-competitive advantage for some groups. I've seen situations where giant developers with competing stadium proposals will fight with themselves over and all of a sudden become great defenders of CEQA if they have somebody who's got a project that's competing with their project. And our friends in organized labor and the tribes are important players on these issues as well, and frankly, in many ways, very prominent because of their political involvement in the legislature on these issues. But even they fight. So the laborers and the carpenters fight a lot of times with the pipe fitters and the IBEW over the value of CEQA. Progressive Democrats, as you can imagine, although they're fewer and fewer, it seems to me, tend to defend CEQA, while moderate Democrats are willing to amend it. Republicans uniformly support gutting CEQA or modifying it, except for where their business interests are telling them not to. CEQA is generally viewed as a cumbersome and litigious law, but little understanding of the appreciation of the benefits. So you hear a lot about how bad CEQA is, how it slows things down, how housing isn't getting built, but you don't hear about the benefits that CEQA has provided, as you heard earlier from Jonathan and from others, of the importance of what it does. Governors and administrations often set the stage for CEQA debates. As I mentioned, Jerry Brown complained about it. I think he once said it was, I can't remember the phrase, he said it was like a mission from God to be able to reform CEQA. And, Governor Newsom.
Kip, I was going to interrupt you because I think he said it was the Lord's work, and if he came and yelled at you in a restaurant, it says something when he's telling you to do it. Anyway.
I think he said reforming CEQA was the Lord's work. I remember that, which, I don't know. Ask Ken Alex, he'll tell you. They often, I will tell you, it's rare when the legislature sort of initiates, although there are some pretty significant exceptions, SB 35 being one of them, where legislators kind of initiate major wholesale changes to CEQA that go anywhere. It's usually the governor's folks who come in and want to make changes, to address or appease some of their constituencies. People forget that CEQA was an important political issue at one time and very popular and bipartisan. It was enacted in the 1970s when the Santa Barbara oil spill, I don't know if anybody remembers that, or the first Earth Day was enacted. Believe it or not, Ronald Reagan, that great progressive environmentalist, was governor at the time, and the Republicans controlled the state assembly, and the environment was an important issue back then, and the Republicans were worried that the Democrats were getting a leg up on the issue, and so the Republican speaker at the time created a select committee on environmental quality, made a bunch of recommendations, including enacting something called a little NEPA, and thereafter legislation was passed. As you can see, on a 59-7 and 39-0 vote, there were no votes in the state Senate on its enactment. And of course, CEQA was kind of little understood back then, and until Friends of Mammoth passed and really kind of opened the door to the debates that are still going on today. I'm going to skip through these pretty quickly. In the 1980s, the big things on CEQA were exempting prisons, which Governor Deukmejian wanted to build, and Loma Prieta earthquake repairs. In the 1990s, during the Wilson era, we had an early recession, and there was a group created, not unlike some of the groups we're seeing now on issues, called Californians Against Red Tape. That ought to tell you something. Pretty much run by the labor and business folks, oil companies and others that were trying to gut CEQA and did not do so, at least from my standpoint. Various good reports have been submitted talking about reforms during that era and were helpful. Some were and some weren't. And there was a kind of a major reform bill that I remember going to a PCL conference in the 1990s, and I was sitting, it was a rainy, cold day, and I had a cold, and I was sitting in the back like you all are, and someone got up, a very distinguished CEQA practitioner, and he said, I don't think this bill really does much. And somebody in the room said, yeah, that was the intent. So it was, sometimes you have to, sort of figure out how to create the impression something's being done. Willie Brown called it the crown jewel of the 1992 session, so I guess it was okay. 1990s, I mentioned, military base reuse and sort of the first inklings of climate change were being proposed, along with the very first bill that was heard in the California Senate, newly minted Environmental Quality Committee, which I was the staff director for, was a bill by Quentin Kopp to truncate CEQA review for what is now called Oracle Park. I think that's what, the Giants Stadium. So, again, hits very close to home for those of you who are Giants fans. I think Melissa mentioned this, and it's important to note, climate change has really scrambled the board. The enactment of AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, modestly named, I might say, identified greenhouse gases as a significant effect on the environment, and the impacts, of course, on CEQA were significant because we now needed to examine, analyze, and mitigate those effects where feasible. Brown's Justice Department at that time, he was the DOJ Attorney General, and my friend Ken Alex started bringing CEQA actions against counties like San Bernardino for not analyzing the greenhouse gas impacts of housing development. And of course that had great effect in a good way in the courts, but a terrible effect in the legislature, where all the developer interests came running to the legislature along with local governments to say, let's get rid of CEQA. Again, I'm going to skip through this. One thing I do want to mention that Melissa did not is, in terms of the bills that we have enacted, I think the singularly most important bill, and I'm sure you all may debate this, was a bill in 2011, 2012, along with SB 743, which you mentioned, that created something called the Environmental Leadership Project process. And the simple elements of that legislation were to truncate, or I shouldn't say truncate, but to expedite CEQA administrative processes by allowing the concurrent preparation of the administrative record with the land use record, which saved some time, and we could argue, save time, and then to call upon the courts, probably unconstitutionally, but so what, to expedite judicial review and to resolve all claims within 270 days. And that has become a template for how we have responded, at least those of us who care about CEQA, in the legislature, to those who say CEQA is too slow, and they're really complaining about the administrative process and the judicial review. So that has been a very important tool. It was one of the central solutions, if I can put it that way, to the infrastructure package last summer, and I think it's sort of at the end of the day protecting the public disclosure and participation, the mitigation requirements, and the standing of parties to sue seem to me to be kind of the core parts of CEQA to be keeping an eye on. In the 2020s, again, we're getting this new thing, and I don't want to offend anybody, and certainly the environmental groups do a good job, but the environmental groups are a little conflicted here because they sidle up with interests who say we need to speed up CEQA to build clean energy projects. Totally right, I get it. The problem is a lot of the things to be done to speed it up are things that do damage to the statute. And, I mean, some of the people in the environmental community will say, well, wait a minute, what about endangered species? What about toxic contamination that was mentioned? What about the things that CEQA will catch that regulatory agencies will ignore? And so there's a real tension between building out the clean energy economy and meeting our climate goals and some of these bedrock environmental laws. Just as Melissa mentioned for housing, same kind of thing. It's being used as a cudgel to go against CEQA to argue that these big environmentally beneficial, quote unquote, projects are, and I might put in that category, carbon capture and storage and gray hydrogen projects ought to be expedited because they're helping meet our climate goals. And so there's a real tension on those issues that reared its head in the context of this infrastructure package in 2023. Thankfully, I think we were able to negotiate a bill that was roughly acceptable to some, at least most in the environmental community, and to protect what was important in CEQA, but it was a real challenge. I'm not going to go through this. I just sort of mentioned some of these things. On environmental justice, like I said, I think CEQA, in an odd way, is the first and most important environmental justice law in the sense that it is not in the hands of an agency to decide what environmental justice is, or a unelected official or elected official to decide that. It's the community's power to do that. And yes, it's a complicated process, and yes, it's difficult, but it still provides and empowers communities in a way that no other statute I can think of does. You know, and we also know, and again, I won't go into it, but I mean, you know, the climate policies that are coming out of some of our agencies, which purport to be good for climate, have the collateral impacts of being very bad for communities, and that's where CEQA can come in and be helpful, and where our regulators, frankly, need to be a little better educated on these things. The enforcement mechanism of CEQA obviously is not a civil penalty or criminal penalties like a lot of regulatory laws. It's the mechanism of the courts, and I think that's both a blessing and a curse. I think, as Melissa pointed out, the statistics bear out that the vast majority of projects are, you know, not subject to litigation. Vast majority are even not subject to an EIR. Most of them are neg-decked or mitigated neg-decked or exempted. And so I just think, you know, dealing with that mythology around CEQA is important. CEQA is 50 now. It's middle-aged, but it's still California's bedrock environmental law. The legislative CEQA debate is, it supersedes serious policy discussion over needed improvements, and I wish we could do more, and I hope you all will help us do more. The challenges ahead, as I mentioned, are, and Melissa touched on this as well, housing. We have some very good, very progressive legislators who are, you know, climate champions, but they're horrible on CEQA because they have basically decided that CEQA, and by the way, this is coming this year, the Coastal Act, these laws that were enacted in the 1970s, are an impediment to building housing, and so there are significant attacks coming on those laws, and I think they will continue to be until we do a better job. I also agree with all the comments about CEQA is not the problem. It is land speculators. It is, you know, this notion that a market for housing is somehow going to correct itself if we deregulate it, I think is just fatuous. The legislature reflects the state as a whole. So you've got people, you know, in the Inland Empire and in the Central Valley who have very mixed views about CEQA and will vote to weaken it. And you've got people out on the coast who will vote to strengthen it. But I still think the CEQA defense bar in the California legislature is thin sometimes, and I worry a lot about it. I think Peter Douglas, the head of the Coastal Commission, who passed away some time ago, used to say the coast is never saved, it's always in the process of being saved. And I think CEQA will always be in the process of being reformed as long as government exists and the courts exist. And let's hope that those reforms are good ones that result in positive improvements to the statute, because it's important. Thank you.
So I imagine there'd be a lot of questions, and thank you, Kip. That's just amazing. You can see why Kip is so refreshing as a voice on the inside. But yes, Phoebe Seaton, everybody.
Hi, thanks. As you can imagine, I probably have a lot to say, but I'm not going to say that much. That was just an incredible panel, and I am terrified that I have to do anything even close to that in a couple minutes on a different panel. So thank you for terrifying me. I just wanted to really use my time to follow up, Kip, on what you said about somebody getting, you know, for all intents and purposes, let go from Caltrans. It's Jeannie Ward-Waller, who's now off on her own, consulting actually with Fearless Advocacy, and she's supposed to be here in like momentarily. Good. And I will introduce her to anybody who wants to do strong transportation work, because she is looking for people to work with to make our transportation system stronger.
Good. I don't know if you guys saw the report on the California Transportation Commission where one of the environmental members, Joe Liu, tried to make a presentation on the adverse impacts of the expansion of, I think, Freeway 15, and they cut him off. So if you think, you know, California government and the Newsom administration and everybody's sort of now bought into the notion of climate change and pollution, it's still we got a lot of work to do.
And thank you. I was wondering that same thing, Phoebe. Jeannie Ward-Waller. I just want to make sure we all know that name, and if we do see her, thank her. So, Jeannie Ward-Waller. Dan O'Connell again.
So first of all, to follow up on Phoebe and Leadership Council and a lot of the environmental justice, we've gained so much capacity And CEQA absolutely is defense of our communities, led by some of these groups. Another just comment from the San Joaquin Valley, in the southern part of the valley. When we are successful with, I think that the use of CEQA, I used to want to do Stalingrad and sue everything. It needs to be strategic. And it needs to be combined with community organizing, which groups like the Leadership Council actually embody, with Veronica Garibay as the other counterpart there. When we win lawsuits, we're having a problem just implementing. We don't control, we're winning a lawsuit, but the County Board of Supervisors are still extremely reactive or reactionary and are not implementing. And then I just wanted to mention to everybody that if you sue, you are at the table. I've had developers literally do Khrushchevs on the table, like pounding the table, but you can craft mitigation to have equity and justice outcomes. But we cannot, litigation is not the same as creating policy or involving culture, and a lot of us in the Valley have to keep lobbying and informing our own elected officials. We're electing a lot of folks of color and a lot of folks that come from communities that are impacted. They get in and they just veer to the middle, and we're losing them on some of these, and we have to keep engaged with getting those elected officials not to drift away from us. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Let me get that question right there, unless Kip, you had observation. The Central Valley turning purple is, that phenomenon. I think that you have a lot to do with that. So, right.
Yeah, thank you, Kip. I guess my question is, are there changes or amendments to CEQA that you would like to see now and not necessarily to strengthen, but are there things that you think needs to be done that could be done to streamline projects that are beneficial that don't actually weaken the law overall?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, the two things that come to mind to me are that reverse CEQA should be fixed. And the other thing is, I think, and we sort of took a run at this in the 1990s, but mitigation monitoring and enforcement needs improvement. So in other words, you get a great outcome on an EIR on litigation, and you're exactly right. And then the question is, 20 years afterwards, is anybody even paying attention to that? After the development's been built, all the trucks are coming in, all the pollution's hitting the community, and nobody's going, hey, what happened to that thing you said you would do? So those are two areas, I think, that we could look at. On the other side of it, I am guided by a lot of you in the environmental community. There are very good, smart people who will say, look, this change in CEQA actually would help for wetlands restoration, or for fish and wildlife, or for reducing pollution in communities. And this is something that we ought to look at. And so I call that incentive-based CEQA. And we've tried to do that in some areas. In some areas it's worked, in some areas it hasn't. But I think looking at those kinds of things, and the Newsom package last summer was an example of, I think, it wasn't just, by the way, it wasn't just CEQA and endangered species. It dealt with project labor agreements. It dealt with a bunch of other approvals for infrastructure projects that tend to slow things down. So I think one of the good things is to get beyond the conversation that CEQA is the problem, and to say, no, there's a lot of other issues that are out there, including the behavior of developers, that needs to be looked at. So I think that's an important way to look at it. But the two reforms that would make CEQA itself better, in my view, are the ones I mentioned.
And Kip, that question is so important. I wanted also to ask Melissa and Jonathan, if you wanted to jump in right now. We've got about 10 more minutes, kind of opening it up to questions for everybody. But the question of what you can do to make CEQA better, love that answer. There's other things too. So. Well,
those are statutory changes. The other thing I will just tell you guys, and God bless CEQA Works and PCL and a lot of you. These are not easy fights, you guys. The politics of CEQA are very complicated in the legislature, and we're always 1 or 2 votes away from losing the statute. So the education component of this, the elevating it, and I know environmental groups have a lot on their docket that they're dealing with, but I think making it clear that CEQA is important, so we're not giving, what you get is Democratic legislators who say, I'm a climate hero, I'm voting for all the climate bills, and then they go out and gut CEQA. And, they need to be held accountable for their work in that area.
Okay, there's about 4 questions up here, but this one first.
Brandon, Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. Brandon Rose. I wear a couple hats in life. I've filed CEQA lawsuits, but I've been a nonprofit. I've also been on boards where we've approved projects as well. But I find the whole CEQA process, it's very closed off. These things are a bookshelf. And you hand a bookshelf of material to anybody in the community, what do you expect them to do with it? And then within that bookshelf, you'll go in, the real nugget will be in a chart. And I remember reading this Curtis Park project. The gas station, they set the throughput of the station so that the outcomes would be right below the thresholds of significance. And it's like, that probably should have been litigated, but it takes an enormous amount of somebody's personal interest and a lot of potential money. I mean, every time my nonprofit files a CEQA lawsuit, it's potentially, it will put you out of business. You know, you're talking about several $100,000 of risk at minimum, paying the other side's legal fees in a worst case scenario. And so that's sort of some of my commentary. But one, in terms of the reform, I was over on the GoBiz website with some of the reform stuff. There's only like 3 projects that were approved from that 2014 bill that fell into the reform. I think there's one under the current law. Like, it's really limited. It surprised me. It required $40,000 payment to have the government review, and all it really does is put you into an accelerated legal review of the 270 odd days. The problem I don't think is with CEQA and the analysis. The problem is this project gets into court for between 3 and 10 years, and we have cases with Cordova Hills. They didn't get an appeals court decision for 10 years, 7 to 10. So that's one thought. Is there a better way to reform it? And 2, do you think there's a middle ground between the bookshelf of a full CEQA analysis and the mitigated neg declarations, which are 50 to 100 pages most of the time, not always, where you see, yeah, there should be some testing done, but I feel like there maybe is some middle ground there. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great comments. A couple things. One is, you raised another idea that I've had over the years is we have, we fund in the government the public interest in defending, in protecting criminal defendants through the state and local public defender's office. We fund at the Public Utilities Commission an office of public advocates who are there simply to litigate against the investor-owned utilities and to be kind of the commission's angel on their, if they do their job well, on their shoulder saying protect ratepayers. Maybe something that would provide funding for CEQA litigants that could help deal with the cost issue. On the courts, that's a good, I think people like Justice Roby on the Court of Appeals here in Sacramento and others, that's a different branch of government, and I think a robust discussion with them and the Chief Justice and the Administrative Office of the courts on what they can be doing. They've kind of told us the 270-day thing is something they can work with, particularly with the ability to extend it if needed. But I agree with you. The courts is an issue, but they have their own workload that they have to manage as well. And I always fear the day when somebody says, "Yeah, that big developer got an expedited CEQA review before the courts, and this child abduction case had to be set aside." So there's always a challenge with that kind of thing. So, but good comments. I agree.
And let me get Sage Sweetwood, and then the next person.
Hi, Kip. I say this as a former mayor, former coastal commissioner, former COG board member, a lot of local and regional government experience. I've always felt that CEQA is perceived as a problem because it really reflects the failure of our local elected planning processes to meet issues head on, right? And having been in that seat before, I fully understand the politics of trying to avoid it. But do you have any thoughts, a little list of 3 or 4 things that might tackle that issue?
Yeah, it's such a great comment and wisdom. You guys have to remember, CEQA was written before modern environmental law, for the most part, existed. So there was no AB 32, there was no California Clean Air Act, there was no California Safe Drinking Water Act. It predated the toxic statutes. And they've kind of come along afterwards, and a lot of people argue, all this CEQA stuff's taken care of there. You don't need it. But as we know, that is not what happens. And so that part of it is the education component. I will tell you, and I think about this a lot, I have this ideal in my head of California environmental law and policy, and then I look around and go, no, sometimes we're like a third world country because, developers buy off city councils, or, they now go to the ballot as the oil companies are doing on the setbacks bill. And so it's a constant fight. I really do believe in the legislature, at least, the best thing you can do, and with the governor too, is to educate these people because they really don't know what they're doing. I had a meeting the other day with the director of OPR, a lovely person, had no clue that she had authority over the CEQA guidelines. Didn't even know. It's all about other kinds of things.
That's quite a thought. Let me ask this.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Ruth McDonald, Sacramento Act. You meant if you could just top three, some climate policies are bad for communities. Would you elucidate on that?
Yeah, this is a big issue I admit this is why I had that disclaimer, because I'm maybe outspoken as a staffer and out ahead of some of our members, but we have, I'm just going to be honest with you, the legislature has delegated too much authority to the State Air Resources Board to implement climate policy, and now what you have is a captive board, an odd regulatory captured board that is a lot of good people, don't get me wrong, the staff is really talented, so it's not a personal thing. But if you go to an air board meeting or hearing, it's filled with lobbyists, lawyers, consultants who are, have a vested financial interest, not an environmental interest, financial interest in outcomes on these very arcane and opaque regulatory programs like the low carbon fuel standard and the cap and trade program, which, by the way, for the former, just so you know, there is not a single word in California law anywhere that mentions the low carbon fuel standard. It's a whole creation of an administrative agency. And cap and trade, same kind of thing. The notion, for example, the legislature said any measures adopted have to show additionality. They have to show that you're reducing emissions over baseline. They have to show that you've looked at the impacts on environmental justice communities. The Air Resources blows completely past that stuff. They just, they say, yeah, we looked at it and we're done, and we took some testimony and we're done. So what I would say is those two measures in particular, obviously the clean trucks, clean cars, those are, although there was some press just this week about the EV charging, and again, another failure of the Air Resources Board to do adequate oversight on the VW settlement. But what I will say is the direct emission reduction programs, generally speaking, that are reducing climate pollution, but also pollution in communities directly, that's good stuff in general. The stuff that isn't good is and I'm not an anti-market guy, but these so-called market-based compliance mechanisms, or mechanisms where people can go out and trade a carbon credit for a ton of pollution reduced by corn ethanol in Iowa. This is bullshit. It's not good environmental policy, and the Air Resources Board has become a captive on those kinds of things. There's some really, Gideon Krakoff and Diane Takvorian, there's some very good people on the Air Board who understand this, but the staff is a real problem, I think, to be honest.
Again, I mean, you can see, Kip, you're amazing, and thank you for these words. I wanted to ask both Melissa and Jonathan for any last words or closing remarks, but thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you
for coming.
I'm trying to think of closing thoughts on the fly here. I don't know. I'm excited that you all were interested to come to this. I feel like, I'm going to move over here so you can see me. I feel like sometimes issues like CEQA, because they're so complicated and you have to get into the nitty gritty to like really understand the importance, it's not like the sexiest issue, most exciting like headline issue to really talk about and be a champion on. That's the case for legislators too. So I just want to say I'm really grateful to you all for sitting through this long talk and having all your good questions. Please keep that up. We need people like you all. I hope that some of you become elected officials. I hope that some of you, are organization leaders one day, or if you're not already, and just really grateful for people who are interested in understanding the importance of some of the things like CEQA in life that are not always the most exciting thing to talk about, but some of the most important things. So just thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. And then Jonathan.
Yeah, quickly. Thank you everyone for being here, especially on a Saturday morning. Hopefully, sort of the studies, the case studies we were to share with you, really do illustrate the importance of CEQA for environmental justice communities. You know, yes, there's lawsuits that come from CEQA, but I think for CEQA to be right is when it doesn't lead to lawsuits, because it ensures that they did the environmental analysis. Is it on? Yeah. They did the environmental analysis correctly. They reached out to the community, and the community was able to work with the city and the developer head on about how to ensure mitigation measures and community benefits that come from it. And that's where we would like to see. I mean, EJ groups really want to see that go through in that sort of process. And so thank you so much for being here, and we'll definitely follow up. If you have any questions, we'll definitely feel free to follow up. Yeah.
Well, then, thank you. I mean, I really appreciate it, and if everybody could join me in thanking Kip, Jonathan, Melissa. Thank you.